3 years of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, battlefield tug-of-war. Diplomatic drama. February 24 marks 3 years since the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out. The conflict is now considered a war of attrition, with neither side making significant breakthroughs on the battlefield. However, there have been recent surprises on the diplomatic front following the return of US President Donald Trump. Is there any hope that the war will end soon? A long and costly war. When Russia began its special military campaign, many predicted that Moscow would quickly take control of most of Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian army stopped Russia's advance before the capital Kiev, pushed Russian troops back from the north, and then launched successful counterattacks in the east and south. Ukraine continues to counterattack in 2023, but equipment limitations and Russia's solid defenses have hampered these campaigns. By early 2024, the war has turned into a phase of attrition. In 2024, Russia begins to gain the upper hand in many important battlefields, including a series of strategic cities in Donetsk Oblast such as Avdiivka, Marinka, and is determined to advance on Pokrovsk. By early 2025, Russian troops control about 18% of Ukraine's territory, an increase of nearly 3.990 kilometers in 2024. At the same time, the situation in Kursk Oblast, Russia, where Ukraine launched its offensive in August 2024 has not seen many important changes. Kiev still retains some territory but has to respond to counterattacks from Russia almost every day. Casualties on both sides are also a notable issue on the battlefield. According to estimates from the Brookings Institute, USA, about 172,000 Russian soldiers were killed and 611,000 soldiers were wounded in 3 years of conflict. Meanwhile, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Army said that the casualties of Russian soldiers on the battlefield were more than 850,000. The Kremlin has not commented on this figure, and the last time Moscow publicly disclosed the figures on Russian soldiers killed was in September 2022, saying that 5.937 soldiers died at that time. On the Ukrainian side, Kiev is witnessing a serious shortage of manpower. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on February 16 that more than 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the first deputy chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces said on February 20 that Ukraine has lost more than 1 million troops in 3 years of fighting with Russia, including 590,000 soldiers in 2024. The two sides have not reached a common voice. From the beginning of the conflict, Russia has declared its goal in the war to be a demilitarized, defascist Ukraine. Over the past 3 years, Moscow has repeatedly stated that the precondition for any peace talks between Russia and Ukraine is that Kiev must withdraw its troops from the regions that Russia has declared annexed, including the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia provinces and the Crimean Peninsula. Russia also demanded that Ukraine commit to not joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, military alliance. Meanwhile, President Zelensky's top demands include a complete withdrawal of Russian troops, the restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders, compensation for damages to Ukraine, and the prosecution of Russian war criminals. Recently, Mr. Zelensky has been said to have a more open stance on peace negotiations, declaring that Kiev is ready to negotiate with Moscow if the US and Europe also participate. In addition to the territorial issue, Ukraine asserts that its future security is equally important. Kiev describes NATO membership as key to this protection, according to the Washington Post. According to President Zelensky, in the event of being unable to join NATO, Kiev will need a strong missile weapons package, a large army, as well as resources and investment to maintain defense capabilities on the border with Russia. If we are not in NATO, then, as I said, the Ukrainian army must be on par with the Russian army, Mr. Zelensky told NBC on February 16. Zelensky also proposed deploying 200,000 foreign troops to Ukraine to protect any ceasefire agreement. On this issue, on February 10, Russian ambassador to the United Nations, UN, Vasily Nebenzia warned that Moscow would consider any foreign military force deployed to Ukraine without the approval of the UN Security Council as a legitimate target for attacks. Will Trump be the game changer? The return of President Trump and his promise to soon end the bloody war has brought hope for an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Trump administration quickly acted with talks between the US and Russian delegations taking place on February 18 in Saudi Arabia. However, Trump's negotiating strategy has met with strong reactions from Ukraine and Europe as these two sides are not part of the negotiations. It is unclear whether Trump's efforts will help end the war. But there has been some recent openness in the positions of Russia and Ukraine. On February 18, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Russia remains committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine and is ready to hold direct talks between President Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky. In another positive sign, Reuters reported on February 21 that Russia may be willing to use some of its $300 billion in frozen assets to help rebuild Ukraine as part of a potential peace deal. However, Russia has insisted that some of the money will be allocated to territories that Moscow has declared annexed. On the Ukrainian side, after the US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia, President Zelensky had a war of words with President Trump over Kiev being sidelined in the talks. However, Ukraine later showed more compromise, announcing that it would finalize a mineral deal with the US on February 24. Earlier, when Mr. Trump proposed exchanging US aid to Ukraine for 50% of Kiev's rare earth minerals, Mr. Zelensky said that Ukraine was not ready to sign the document because it did not include any security guarantees. Experts say that Kiev now has fewer options and risks being put in a fait accompli situation by the US. Ukraine sees that the US may decide Kiev's fate, and that fate seems to have only two options, hard or harder, said Mr. Steve Ganyard, a retired US Marine Corps colonel. According to Mr. Ganyard, the hard option is an agreement in which Ukraine cedes the right to exploit resources to the US in exchange for security guarantees. The harder option is Kiev being forced to accept concessions in the Russia-Ukraine peace deal under pressure from Washington. That scenario is all the more likely as Europe, which Ukraine looks to for support to gain more leverage at the negotiating table, is left out of potential peace deals. US puts pressure on Ukraine over draft resolution condemning Russia at UN. The US has asked Ukraine to withdraw its annual draft resolution condemning Russia's war and replace it with a softer statement drafted by the US. The Washington Post reported on February 22. The US move has stunned Ukraine. According to the Washington Post, Kiev has refused to withdraw its draft resolution, which was scheduled to be introduced at the UN on February 24. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on February 22 that Washington has proposed a simple, historic resolution at the UN that calls on all member states to support it to chart a path to peace. Through this resolution, we affirm that this conflict is terrible, that the UN can help end it, and that peace is possible. We strongly believe that this is the time to commit to ending the war, Rubio said. However, Ukraine saw the US drafted resolution as an attempt to downplay Russia's responsibility for the war. The source said that Washington first reviewed the Ukrainian draft resolution and requested revisions. The US then introduced a completely new resolution and asked Kiev to withdraw its version, which had been agreed with other partner countries that were planning to sign.